It is 2:18 in the morning, April the 15th, 1912. The air is so cold it burns your lungs. The stars are out, more stars than you have ever seen in your life, because there is no moon tonight. There is no light at all except what comes from the ship, and the ship is dying. You can feel it under your feet. The deck is no longer level. It is tilting forward, slowly, the way a table tilts when you lean on one end. And if you are standing on this deck right now, in this frozen darkness, you know exactly what that tilt means. You know what is coming. You can hear it. The groaning of steel somewhere deep below. A sound that does not belong to any ship that is supposed to float. You can hear the screaming too. Hundreds of voices, maybe more, somewhere behind you, somewhere below you. People who are running out of places to go. The lifeboats are gone. Most of them, anyway. Launched half full into the black water, because there was not enough time and not enough order and not enough courage to fill them. And in the middle of all of this, the cold, the noise, the ship bending under its own impossible weight, there is a man standing alone at the railing. He is tall. He is well dressed. Even now, even in this moment, he looks like someone who belongs in a room where decisions are made. He has a life jacket on, but it does not seem like he put it on for himself. It seems like he put it on because it was the proper thing to do. This man is the richest person on this ship. He might be the richest person in the entire world right now, standing right here on this tilting deck, in the dark. He has enough money to buy the ship he is standing on. He has enough money to buy the company that built it. He has enough influence, enough power, enough weight in the world to walk into almost any room on earth and have every single head turn. And none of that matters now. Not 1 cent of it. Not 1 syllable of his name. Because 20 minutes ago he put his wife into a lifeboat. She is 19 years old. She is 5 months pregnant with their child. And when the officer told him he could not go with her, "Women and children only, sir," he did not argue. He did not shout. He did not reach into his pocket and pull out the kind of money that makes problems disappear. He just stepped back. He helped her in. And he let her go. Now he is standing here, alone. And the water is coming. You can see it now if you look over the railing. It is climbing the side of the ship, black and impossibly calm, rising the way floodwater rises in a basement. Slowly at first, then faster, then all at once. He knows he is going to die. He has known it for over an hour, and he has spent that hour not saving himself. He has spent it making sure other people got off this ship. So here is the question, and it is the question this entire story is built around. Who was this man? How did he end up here, on the most famous ship in history, on the most terrible night of the 20th century? What kind of life did he live before this moment? What did he build? What did he break? What did he love? And why, when everything was on the line, when his money and his name and his power meant nothing, why did he choose to stay? His name was John Jacob Astor IV, and this is his story. Not the version you learnt in school, not the version they put on plaques and in museum exhibits. The real version, the version with love in it and scandal in it, and pain in it and courage in it. The version that starts in the golden palaces of New York City and ends in the freezing water of the North Atlantic. Stay with me, because once you hear this story, really hear it, you will never forget it. To understand who John Jacob Astor IV was, you have to understand what the name Astor meant in America. And what it meant was everything. The Astor family was not just rich. They were the foundation. They were the bedrock. If you could dig beneath the streets of Manhattan, beneath the pavement and the subway tunnels and the basements of every brownstone on the Upper East Side, you would find the Astor name carved into the stone underneath. Because the Astors did not just live in New York, they owned New York. It started with the first John Jacob Astor, John's great-grandfather, a German immigrant who arrived in America in 1784 with almost nothing. He got into the fur trade. He was smart. He was relentless. He was the kind of man who could see what a piece of land would be worth in 30 years and buy it today. And that is exactly what he did. While everyone else was buying and selling furs, the first John Jacob Astor was buying Manhattan. block by block. He bought farmland north of what was then the city, and waited. He bought waterfront property and waited. He bought plots that other people thought were worthless, muddy, far from anything too far uptown to matter, and he waited. And the city came to him. It always came to him. By the time he died in 1848, the first John Jacob Astor was the richest man in America. Not one of the richest. The richest. And he left behind a fortune that was almost entirely built on Manhattan real estate. That fortune passed down through the family like a river, getting wider with every generation. By the time John Jacob Astor IV was born on July 13th, 1864, the Astor family controlled so much of New York City that it was almost impossible to walk through certain neighborhoods without stepping on land they owned. They owned hotels. They owned office buildings. They owned entire blocks of apartment buildings where thousands of ordinary New Yorkers paid rent every month. And all of that rent, every dollar, every coin, flowed upward into the Astor accounts. John Jacob Astor IV inherited a fortune that, in today's money, was worth roughly $2.5 billion. Let that number sit for a moment. $2.5 billion. That is not the kind of money that buys you a nice house. That is the kind of money that buys you a city. That is the kind of money that makes governments return your phone calls. That is the kind of money that puts your name on buildings and hospitals and libraries and streets, not because you asked, but because people want to be close to you. And John had that money from the day he was born. He grew up in it. He breathed it. He wore it. The family mansion on Fifth Avenue was not a home. It was a palace. The dinner parties were not meals. They were events that shaped who mattered in New York and who did not. To be invited to an Astor dinner was to be accepted. To be turned away was to be erased. And John was at the center of all of it. But here is what makes John Jacob Astor IV different from every other Gilded Age millionaire you have ever heard of. He was not just a man with money. He was a man with a mind. And his mind never stopped working. John went to Harvard. He graduated in 1888. And almost immediately he started doing things that no one in his social class was expected to do. He became an inventor. A real inventor. Not a hobbyist, not a rich man playing with gadgets in his study. He filed actual patents. He designed a turbine engine. He worked on a brake system for bicycles. He developed a device called a pneumatic road improver, a machine designed to flatten and improve roads. These were not toys. These were serious engineering projects from a man who could have spent every day of his life doing absolutely nothing and still been one of the most powerful people in America. But John did not want to do nothing. He wanted to think. He wanted to create. He wanted to understand how the world worked, not just own pieces of it. And then, in 1894, he did something that truly set him apart. He wrote a novel, a science fiction novel. It was called A Journey in Other Worlds. And it was not some vanity project printed on expensive paper and handed out to friends. It was a real book, published by a real publisher, sold in real bookstores. The story was set in the year 2000. It imagined a future with anti-gravity technology, with travel to Jupiter and Saturn, with a world that had been reshaped by science and discovery. Now, was it a great novel? Honestly, no. The critics were not kind. The writing was stiff in places, the characters flat, and some of the ideas were strange, even for science fiction. But the fact that he wrote it at all, the fact that one of the richest men in the world sat down and imagined the future and put it on paper, that tells you something about who John Jacob Astor IV really was. He was curious, genuinely curious. He looked at the world and saw not just what was there, but what could be there. And he wanted to be part of building it. Then came the war. In 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out. The United States went to war with Spain over Cuba and the Philippines. And John Jacob Astor IV did something that stunned almost everyone who knew him. He did not just donate money to the war effort, although he did that too, generously. He equipped and funded his own artillery unit, his own battery of soldiers. It was called the Astor Battery. He paid for the guns. He paid for the horses. He paid for the uniforms and the supplies and the ammunition. And then he did the one thing that nobody expected from a man worth billions. He went himself. He volunteered. He served as a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. He went to Cuba. He was in the field. He was not sitting in a tent somewhere far from the fighting, giving orders from behind a desk. He was there. Was he on the front lines charging into battle? No, probably not. He was not a career soldier, and the army was not going to put one of the richest men in the world in direct line of enemy fire if they could help it. But he went. He showed up. He put on the uniform, and he served. And for a man who could have bought his way out of anything, who could have written a check and gone back to his Fifth Avenue mansion and never thought about Cuba again, that meant something. It meant something to the soldiers who served alongside him. It meant something to the public, and I think it meant something to John himself, because everything about John Jacob Astor IV suggests a man who was restless, a man who did not want to be defined by his family name or his bank account, a man who wanted to earn something, respect, adventure, purpose, that money could not simply purchase. But here is the other side, the side that is harder to admire, the side that makes this story complicated, the way all true stories are complicated. The Astor fortune was built on the backs of ordinary people. The family's wealth came from real estate, from owning the buildings where working-class New Yorkers lived, and those buildings were not palaces. Many of them were tenements, cramped, overcrowded, poorly maintained apartment buildings, packed with immigrant families who had nowhere else to go. Families who paid rent they could barely afford to a family that had more money than any human being could spend in 100 lifetimes. The Astors were landlords, and not always good ones. The buildings deteriorated. The conditions worsened, and the rent kept flowing upward. New York in the Gilded Age was a city of impossible contrasts, extraordinary wealth existing right next to desperate poverty, and the Astor family was one of the sharpest examples of that divide. John Jacob Astor IV did not create that system. He was born into it. He inherited it the way he inherited his eye color and his height. But he benefited from it every single day of his life. Every dollar he spent, every hotel he built, every patent he filed, every novel he wrote, all of it was possible because of a fortune that came from people who had almost nothing. And that is the tension at the heart of this story. John Jacob Astor IV was brilliant. He was brave. He was curious and creative and willing to serve his country when he did not have to. But he was also a man who lived at the very top of a system that crushed the people at the bottom. He could be both of those things at the same time, because people are not simple, especially not people with this much power. So when you picture John Jacob Astor IV, do not picture a hero. Do not picture a villain. Picture a man. A complicated man. A man who built the St. Regis Hotel in 1904, one of the most beautiful and luxurious buildings New York had ever seen, and also a man who collected rent from tenement buildings where children slept 4 to a room. Picture a man who wrote science fiction about the future, and also a man who lived in a world that treated its present with terrible cruelty. Hold both of those truths at the same time, because that is who he was. And what happened to him next? The scandal, the love, the ship, will not make sense unless you understand that John Jacob Astor IV was never just one thing. He was everything. All of it. All at once. John Jacob Astor IV married for the first time in 1891. Her name was Ava Lowell Willing. She came from a Philadelphia family with the right pedigree, the right connections, and the right last name. In the world of Gilded Age high society, a marriage was not just about love, it was about alignment. It was about two fortunes shaking hands. It was about making sure the right people stayed at the top and the wrong people stayed out. And by every measure that world cared about, John and Ava were the perfect match. She was beautiful. She was polished. She knew how to enter a room and make it feel smaller just by standing in it. He was the richest young man in New York. Together, they were supposed to be the golden couple, the pair that everyone else in high society pointed to and said, that is what success looks like. But behind the closed doors of their Fifth Avenue mansion, the marriage was cold. It was quiet in the worst possible way, the kind of quiet that sits between two people who have stopped trying. Ava was ambitious. Socially, she wanted to be seen. She wanted to host. She wanted to be at the center of every important gathering in New York. John was different. He wanted to tinker with his inventions. He wanted to read. He wanted to disappear into ideas and projects that had nothing to do with which family was feuding with which other family over a seating arrangement at a dinner party. They had 2 children together, Vincent, born in 1891, and Ava, born in 1892. And for a while, the children held things together the way children sometimes do. Not because the parents are happy, but because the parents are too busy, or too proper, or too afraid to admit that they are not. But eventually, even the appearance of a marriage could not be maintained. By the early 1900s, John and Ava were living separate lives. He was in New York. She was traveling. They attended the same events, but stood on opposite sides of the room. The warmth between them, if there had ever been any real warmth, was gone. And in 1906, John did something that respectable men in his world almost never did. He filed for divorce. Now you have to understand what divorce meant in 1906. It was not like today. Today, divorce is common. It is sad, but it is understood. People grow apart. They move on. Nobody throws a parade, but nobody throws a stone either. In 1906, divorce was a grenade. Especially for someone like John Jacob Astor IV, especially in New York, especially in the circles he moved in, the old money circles, the Fifth Avenue circles, the circles where reputation was everything and scandal was death. The divorce was finalized in 1909, and it was brutal. The newspapers covered every detail, every rumor, every whispered accusation. Ava received a settlement that was enormous by any standard. Money, property, security for the rest of her life. But she also received something else. Sympathy. The public, at least much of the public, saw Ava as the wronged woman, the discarded wife, the mother whose home had been broken by a man who simply decided he was done. And John, the richest man in New York, the man whose family name was carved into the city itself, became, overnight, the villain. High society closed ranks against him. Not completely, not officially, but in the subtle, devastating way that only high society knows how to do. Invitations slowed down. Conversations at parties became shorter. Old friends suddenly had other plans. The world that John had been born into, the world he had always taken for granted, began to pull away from him like a tide going out. And then things got worse, because John Jacob Astor IV fell in love again. Her name was Madeline Talmage Force. She was 18 years old. John was 47. Let those numbers sit for a moment. 18 and 47. A gap of 29 years. Madeline was a year younger than John's own son, Vincent. She was younger than some of the staff who worked in John's household. She had grown up in a good family, respectable, comfortable, educated, but not an Astor-level family. Not a family with a name that opened every door in America. She was, by the standards of John's world, a nobody. A beautiful nobody. A young, intelligent, charming nobody, but a nobody nonetheless. And when the news broke that John Jacob Astor IV was seeing this girl, this teenager, New York lost its mind. The newspapers went wild. The headlines were vicious. They called him an old fool. They called him a predator. They called Madeline a fortune hunter, a gold digger, a girl who had traded her youth for a mansion. Every detail of their relationship was dissected, mocked, and held up for public judgment. And the judgment was harsh. But the newspapers were the least of it. What really hurt, what cut John to the bone, if the accounts from people who knew him can be trusted, was the reaction from his own world. The churches refused to marry them. John went to minister after minister, pastor after pastor, and was told no, one after another. No, we will not perform this ceremony. No, we will not bless this union. The refusals were not always spoken out loud. Sometimes they came in letters. Sometimes they came through intermediaries. But the message was always the same. You have done something we do not approve of, and we will not help you do it. Friends sent back wedding invitations unopened. Social clubs, the places where John had spent his entire adult life, the clubs where he drank whiskey and played cards and talked business with men he had known since Harvard. Quietly let it be known that his presence was no longer desired. Not banned. Never officially banned. That would have been too crude, too public, too honest. Just no longer desired. The invitations stopped. The phone calls stopped. The ease and comfort of belonging stopped. One minister, a man named Colonel Lambert, finally agreed to perform the ceremony. He was not from John's usual circle. He was not the kind of minister who officiated at Astor-level weddings. But he said yes when everyone else said no. And on September 11th, 1911, John Jacob Astor IV married Madeline Talmadge Force at Beechwood, the Astor estate in Newport, Rhode Island. The wedding was small, quiet, almost secretive. There were no crowds, no grand society affair, no hundreds of guests filling a cathedral, just a ceremony in a home, witnessed by a handful of people who had not turned their backs. And then they were married, and then the real question began, the question that has followed this story for over 100 years. Was this love? Was this real, honest, mutual love between two people who happened to be separated by 29 years and an ocean of money and power? Or was this something else? Was this a rich old man buying a young woman's life? Was Madeline a victim of her time, a girl who had been taught that her greatest asset was her beauty, and that her best option was to marry well? Did she love him? Did she even know him well enough to love him? Did he love her, truly love her? Or did he love the idea of starting over with someone young enough to make him feel young too? I am going to be honest with you. I do not know the answer. Nobody does. Not for certain. The people who were there are all gone now. The letters and diaries that survive tell pieces of the story, but not the whole story. What I can tell you is this. Every account from people who saw John and Madeline together describes a couple that seemed genuinely happy. He was attentive to her. She was warm with him. They laughed together. They held hands. When they walked into a room, they walked in together. Not the way a rich man walks in with a trophy on his arm, but the way two people walk in who actually want to be next to each other. Was that performance? Maybe. Rich people in the Gilded Age were very good at performing. But maybe it was real. Maybe two people who had been rejected by the entire world found in each other the one thing the world could not take from them. Each other. I want you to hold that question. Do not answer it yet. Just hold it. Turn it over in your mind the way you would turn over a stone in your hand, feeling the weight of it. Because the answer, if there is an answer, is coming. It is not coming in words. It is coming in what John Jacob Astor IV did on the last night of his life. And what he did will tell you more about what he felt for Madeline Force than any love letter ever could. After the wedding, John and Madeline did what you might expect two people to do when the whole world has turned against them. They left. They packed their things, they boarded a ship, and they sailed away from New York, away from the newspapers, away from the whispers and the cold shoulders and the doors that had been closed in their faces. They went to Europe, and for a little while, they were free. They went to Paris first, and Paris in 1911 was exactly what they needed, beautiful, indifferent, and utterly unconcerned with what New York society thought about anything. In Paris, John was not a scandal. He was a rich American tourist with a pretty wife, and Paris had seen 1,000 of those. Nobody stared at them at dinner. Nobody whispered behind their hands when they walked through the lobby of a hotel. They were just two people in a city that had better things to do than judge them. And for the first time since they had fallen in love, John and Madeline could breathe. They could walk down a street without worrying about which journalist was following them. They could sit at a cafe and hold hands without wondering which society columnist would write about it the next morning. They could just be two people, married, together. And isn't that what every couple wants? Isn't that the simplest, most basic thing? To be with the person you love, without the rest of the world interfering. John and Madeline had everything money could buy. But that simple thing, peace, privacy, the right to love someone without being punished for it, that was the one thing their money had not been able to give them in New York. Paris gave it to them for free. From Paris they travelled south. They went to Egypt. They sailed the Nile. They stood in front of the pyramids, those ancient, impossible things, and for a moment, their own problems must have felt very small. Because the pyramids do that to people. They remind you that the world was here long before you arrived and will be here long after you are gone, and that whatever you are carrying, whatever shame or anger or heartbreak you are dragging behind you, it is temporary. It will pass. The stones will remain. John and Madeline spent weeks in Egypt. They rode camels. They toured temples. They took photographs. Madeline smiling in the desert sun, squinting against the light, her hand resting on the arm of a man who looked, in every picture, like he could not believe his luck. And maybe he could not. Maybe after everything, the divorce, the rejection, the cruelty of people he had once considered friends, maybe John looked at this young woman who had chosen him, who had stood beside him when everyone else walked away, and thought, how did I get so lucky? Then they moved on. They sailed the Mediterranean. They visited the great ports of southern Europe, Marseille, Naples, the ancient harbours where ships had been coming and going for thousands of years. Everywhere they went, they were just John and Madeline. Not Mr. and Mrs. Astor, not the scandal, not the headline, just two people discovering the world together. And then, something happened that changed everything. Madeline told John she was pregnant. Try to imagine that moment. Try to put yourself in that room, wherever they were, whatever hotel in whatever city, and imagine the look on John Jacob Astor's face when his young wife told him that they were going to have a child. He was 47 years old. He had 2 grown children from his first marriage, Vincent, who was 20, and Ava, who was 19. His relationship with both of them was complicated. Vincent, in particular, had been distant and cold about the new marriage. He disapproved. He made his disapproval known. And that had hurt John more than he would probably ever admit, because fathers do not stop wanting their sons' approval, no matter how old they get. But now there was going to be a new child. A fresh start. A baby born not into the cold wreckage of his first marriage, but into something warm and chosen and real. By every account that survives, John was overjoyed, not quietly pleased, not dutifully satisfied, overjoyed. He talked about the baby constantly. He made plans. He imagined the future. For a man who had spent the last 2 years being told by the world that he was a fool, that his marriage was a mistake, that he should be ashamed of himself, the news that he was going to be a father again must have felt like proof that he had been right. That this was real, that the love he felt for Madeline was not a delusion or a scandal, but a living, growing thing that was about to become a person. And with the pregnancy came a decision. The baby would be born in America. John was clear about this. There was no discussion, no debate. His child would be born in New York City, in the city that bore his family's name, in the city that had turned its back on him. Why? Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was simply the deep, unshakable belief that New York was home, that no matter what the newspapers said or the social clubs did or the ministers refused, New York was where an Astor belonged. Or maybe it was something simpler than all of that. Maybe John wanted to go home because that is what people do when the most important thing in their life is about to happen. They go home. They want to be in familiar rooms, surrounded by familiar streets, in the place where they know the sound of the rain and the smell of the air and the way the light comes through the windows in the morning. They want their child to open its eyes for the first time in the place they love most. And for John Jacob Astor IV, that place was New York. So they began to plan their return. They would sail from Europe, they would cross the Atlantic, they would arrive in New York, and the baby would be born there. And whatever the world thought of them, their child would be an American. Their child would be a New Yorker. Their child would be an Astor. And here is what I need you to feel right now, before we go any further. I need you to feel the warmth of those months. I need you to hold that image in your mind. John and Madeline in Egypt, in Paris, on the Mediterranean, laughing, planning, dreaming about their baby. I need you to feel the golden light of that time, because this is the last golden light in this story. Everything after this, everything, is cold and dark and full of the sound of water. And the grief that is coming will only hit you as hard as this happiness hits you now. So let it hit you. Let yourself love them both for a moment. Let yourself believe, the way they believed, that everything was going to be fine, that they were going home, that the baby would be born in New York, that the world would come around eventually, the way the world always does, and that their story would end the way love stories are supposed to end. They believed that. They truly believed it. And they booked their tickets home on the finest, safest, most magnificent ship the world had ever built. April the 10th, 1912. Southampton, England. The morning is cool and grey, the way English mornings almost always are, and the dock is chaos. Thousands of people, luggage stacked in mountains, porters shouting, children crying, the whole noisy, messy, beautiful spectacle of a great ship about to depart. And above it all, rising against the sky like a steel cliff, is the Titanic. You have heard the name 1,000 times. You have seen the movies and the documentaries and the photographs. But try, just for a moment, to forget everything you know about what is going to happen. Try to see this ship the way the people standing on that dock saw it on the morning of April the 10th. To them, it was not a tragedy. It was a triumph. It was the most extraordinary thing human beings had ever put on the water. 882 feet long, 46,000 tons, 11 stories tall from the waterline to the top of her funnels. She had a swimming pool. She had a gymnasium with electric horses and a rowing machine. She had a Turkish bath with heated tile floors and bronze lamps that glowed like something from a Roman palace. She had a grand staircase that swept down through the center of the ship, like the staircase in a European opera house, with an ornate glass dome above it that filled the whole space with natural light. She had first-class suites that were nicer than most apartments in London or New York. Suites with sitting rooms and private bathrooms and windows that looked out on the open ocean. She had 4 funnels, each one wide enough to drive 2 trains through, and only 3 of them actually worked. The 4th was there just for show because the builders wanted the ship to look as powerful as she was. She was, by every measure, the largest, most luxurious, most technologically advanced vessel ever built. And the people who designed her believed, truly, honestly believed, that she could not sink. Not unsinkable in the way a salesman says something to sell tickets. Unsinkable in the way engineers say something when they have studied the math and run the numbers and built something that on paper has no way of going under. She had a double-bottomed hull. She had 16 watertight compartments that could be sealed off individually, so that even if the worst happened, even if she struck something and tore open her side, the flooding could be contained. The water could be boxed in. The ship would survive. That was the belief. That was the promise. And on the morning of April the 10th, when John Jacob Astor IV helped his pregnant young wife up the first-class gangway, that promise felt as solid as the steel plates under their feet. John had booked one of the finest suites on the ship, parlor suite C62 through 64, on sea deck. It was enormous. A private sitting room, a bedroom, a bathroom with running water, elegant furniture, thick carpets, the kind of space that made you forget you were on a ship at all. The suite cost over $50,000 in today's money. For John, that was pocket change. But it was not just about the money. It was about comfort. Madeline was 5 months pregnant. She needed rest. She needed warmth. She needed to feel safe. And on the Titanic, she had all of that. They also brought companions. John's valet, a man named Victor Robbins, Madeline's maid, a woman named Rosalie Bidouar, and her nurse, Caroline Endres. And of course, their dog, a young Airedale named Kitty, who was housed in the ship's kennel on F-deck. Even the dog travelled in style on the Titanic. The first few days of the voyage were perfect. That is not an exaggeration. The weather was calm, the sea was smooth, the sky was clear. In first class, the days passed like a dream. Breakfast in the dining saloon, eggs, kippers, fresh fruit, pastries, a walk on the promenade deck, the salt air cool against your face, the ocean stretching out in every direction until it touched the sky. Lunch, tea, dinner. And dinner on the Titanic was not a meal. Dinner on the Titanic was an event. 11 courses, oysters, filet mignon, lamb with mint sauce, roasted squab, champagne, dessert, cigars and brandy in the smoking room afterward, where the richest men in the world sat in leather chairs and talked about business and politics and the future and all the things that rich men talk about when they think the future belongs to them. John was in his element. For the first time since the scandal of his second marriage, he was back among his own kind. The millionaires, the industrialists, the titans of the Gilded Age. And on the Titanic, in this floating world where class was everything and the first-class passengers were treated like royalty, John was king again. He dined with Benjamin Guggenheim, the mining magnate. He spoke with Isidore Straus, the co-owner of Macy's department store. He chatted with Archibald Butt, the military aide to President Taft. These were his people. This was his world. And for a few beautiful days, the world had taken him back. Madeline was happy too. She walked the decks in the mornings, one hand on the railing, one hand on her belly. She wrote letters. She read. She sat in the first-class lounge with a cup of tea and watched the ocean go by, and probably thought about the nursery she would decorate when they got home, about the baby, about New York, about the life that was waiting for them on the other side of this crossing. 4 days, that is how long the good times lasted. 4 perfect, golden, impossibly peaceful days. And then the 5th day began, April the 14th, 1912, a Sunday. The day started like every other day of the crossing. Breakfast, church service in the first-class dining room, lunch. The afternoon passed quietly. The air was getting colder, noticeably colder, but nobody thought much of it. They were in the North Atlantic. It was April. Cold air was normal. By evening, the temperature had dropped sharply. The sea was dead calm. Not a wave, not a ripple. Just a flat black sheet of water stretching out to the horizon. That calmness was actually dangerous, though nobody on board knew it. Waves breaking against an iceberg make the berg visible from a distance. Without waves, an iceberg sits in the dark water like a ghost, silent, invisible, lethal. But nobody told the passengers that. Nobody told them about the ice warnings that had been coming in all day. Messages from other ships, reporting large icebergs directly in the Titanic's path. Those messages were received by the wireless operators. Some were passed to the bridge. Some were not. Some were set aside because the wireless operators were busy sending personal messages for the first-class passengers. Birthday greetings, business telegrams, love notes to people back home. The warnings were there. The danger was real, but the ship did not slow down. She kept going, full speed ahead, 22.5 knots through an ice field in the middle of the North Atlantic on a moonless night. Because the Titanic could not sink, because the schedule mattered, because arriving late in New York was unthinkable, because the pride of the White Star Line and the reputation of the greatest ship ever built could not be compromised by something as ordinary as ice. And now I need to tell you something. I need to give you a number, because this number is important. From the moment John Jacob Astor IV helped his pregnant wife up that gangway in Southampton, to the moment his life changed forever, he had 5 days, 2 hours, and 40 minutes. 5 days, 2 hours, and 40 minutes of normal life, of meals and walks and conversations and sleep, and all the ordinary minutes that make up a human existence. He did not know the number was ticking down. He did not hear the clock. He sat in the smoking room on the evening of April the 14th, comfortable, warm, maybe a little tired, maybe thinking about New York, maybe thinking about the baby, maybe not thinking about anything at all. And the clock ticked, and the ship moved through the water, and somewhere ahead, in the freezing dark, a piece of ice the size of a building sat waiting. At exactly 11:40 on the night of April the 14th, 1912, a lookout named Frederick Fleet stared into the darkness ahead of the ship and saw something. A shape, darker than the sky behind it, growing larger, growing fast. He grabbed the telephone and called the bridge. 3 words. Iceberg. Right ahead. On the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch reacted instantly. He ordered the helm hard to starboard. He ordered the engines reversed. For 37 seconds, the Titanic tried to turn. 37 seconds. That is all the time there was between the warning and the impact. And it was not enough. At 11:40, the starboard side of the Titanic scraped against the iceberg. The collision lasted less than 10 seconds. Most people on board barely felt it. Some passengers later described it as a slight shudder, like the ship had rolled over a speed bump. Some said it sounded like someone had dragged a giant fingernail along the side of the hull. A few people in the lower decks felt something more, a grinding vibration, a sound of tearing metal, something that made them sit up in bed and look at each other and wonder what that was. John Jacob Astor IV was in his stateroom with Madeleine when it happened. By most accounts, he felt the impact, a tremor, a shaking, and he got up immediately. He told Madeleine to stay in the suite. He dressed quickly and went out to investigate. He found a steward in the corridor and asked what had happened. The steward did not know. John went up to the deck. The night was bitterly, impossibly cold. The temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees below freezing. The air hit his face like a slap. The stars were bright, brighter than they had any right to be, because there was no moon, and no clouds and no city light for 1,000 miles in any direction. And there, on the deck, John saw something that told him everything he needed to know. He saw chunks of ice scattered across the forward well deck. He saw officers moving quickly, not running, but moving with a purpose that was not casual, not routine. He saw their faces, and in those faces, John Jacob Astor IV, inventor, soldier, builder, a man who understood engineering and physics and the way things worked, read the truth. Something was very wrong. Below the waterline, the iceberg had done its work. It had not punched a single massive hole in the side of the ship. It had done something worse. It had opened a series of narrow gashes and buckled plates along a 300-foot stretch of the hull, allowing seawater to pour into 6 of the ship's 16 watertight compartments. The ship had been designed to float with any 4 of those compartments flooded, maybe even 5, but not 6. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was on board. He went below to inspect the damage within minutes of the collision, and when he came back up, he told Captain Edward Smith the truth that only a few people on that ship would learn before it was too late. The Titanic was going to sink. She had maybe an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours if they were lucky, but she was going down. There was no stopping it. The math was simple, and the math was final. Water was pouring in faster than any pump could remove it. The weight of the water in the bow was pulling the front of the ship down, which meant more portholes and more seams were going underwater, which meant more water was coming in, which meant the bow sank faster, which meant more water, which meant faster. It was a death spiral. Slow at first, then faster, then unstoppable. Captain Smith gave the order to uncover the lifeboats, and here is the number that seals everything that follows. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. 20. Those 20 lifeboats had a total capacity of about 1,178 people. There were approximately 2,208 people on board. That meant roughly half the people on this ship were going to die no matter what happened, even if every single lifeboat was launched perfectly full. And they would not be, because panic and chaos and confusion would see to that. Half the people on the Titanic had no way off the ship. John went back to the stateroom. He found Madeleine awake, confused, frightened. And here is what he did, and this is important, because it tells you exactly who this man was in a crisis. He did not tell her what he knew. He did not say the ship is sinking. He did not say we might die. He told her to get dressed warmly. He helped her put on heavy clothing, layers, a coat, good shoes. He took her life jacket and put it on her himself, adjusting the straps, making sure it was tight, making sure it would hold her if she ended up in the water. He was calm. He was steady. He was the kind of calm that only comes when a person has already accepted the worst and decided not to waste a single second on fear. He put on his own life jacket too. Then he took Madeleine's arm and they walked out of the stateroom together. They walked down the corridor and up the stairs and out onto the boat deck. And the boat deck was a world that had not existed an hour ago. People were everywhere, some in nightgowns, some in full evening dress, some clutching children, some clutching suitcases. The crew was trying to load the lifeboats, but the process was confused, disorganized, almost amateurish. There had been no proper lifeboat drill. The passengers did not know which boat they were assigned to. The crew did not all know how to operate the davits, the mechanical arms that lowered the boats to the water. And nobody, not the crew, not the officers, not the passengers, fully understood yet how little time they had. The first lifeboats launched were barely half full. Lifeboat 7 went away with only 28 people in it. It could have held 65. Lifeboat 1, the emergency cutter on the starboard side, left with only 12 people in it. 12 people in a boat built for 40. Women were refusing to get in. They did not believe the ship was really sinking. They thought the lifeboats were more dangerous than the ship. They looked down at the water, 60 feet below, black, terrifyingly calm. And they said, "No, I would rather stay here. My husband is here. I will wait." And so the boats went down half empty while 2,000 people stood on a sinking ship. Distress rockets were being fired now, white rockets that shot up into the black sky and exploded into showers of white sparks that drifted slowly down. The rockets were supposed to signal any nearby ships, but the nearest ship that could see them, a cargo vessel called the Californian, sitting about 10 miles away, did not respond. Her wireless operator had gone to bed. Her officers saw the rockets but could not agree on what they meant. They watched. They discussed. They did nothing. The Carpathia, another ship, had received the Titanic's distress call and was racing toward them at full speed. But the Carpathia was 58 miles away. At her top speed, she would not arrive for 4 hours. The Titanic did not have 4 hours. John understood all of this. He had spoken to the officers. He had seen the water level rising. He had walked to the bow and looked down and seen the ocean climbing the hull, swallowing the ship inch by inch. He was an intelligent man, an engineer in his soul, and he could do the arithmetic in his head as clearly as Thomas Andrews had done it on paper. This ship was going to sink. There were not enough lifeboats, and if Madeleine and their unborn child were going to survive, he needed to get them off the ship now. The temperature of the water that night was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. I need you to understand what that means. Water that cold does not just make you uncomfortable. It kills you. It kills you fast. When a human body enters water at 28 degrees, the cold hits your nervous system like an electrical shock. Your muscles seize. Your blood vessels constrict. Your heart rate spikes wildly and then begins to fail. You gasp involuntarily, and if your head is underwater when you gasp, you inhale water and you drown in seconds. If you manage to keep your head above water, you have maybe 15 minutes before hypothermia shuts your body down. Your arms stop working first, then your legs, then your mind begins to fog. You stop shivering, which feels like relief but is actually the opposite. It means your body has given up trying to warm itself, and then you die. That is what was waiting in the water below the ship. That is what John Jacob Astor IV was looking at when he looked over the railing into the darkness. Not just water, not just cold. Death. Fast, brutal, inescapable death. And he knew that if Madeleine went into that water, 5 months pregnant, in a life jacket, screaming his name, she and their baby would last maybe 10 minutes, maybe less. So he did what he had to do. He walked her to the lifeboats. He held her arm. He guided her through the crowds and the confusion and the noise. And he did it all with the calm, measured steadiness of a man who has already made his decision. He was going to save her. He was going to save their child. And whatever happened to him after that, whatever the water did to him, whatever the cold did to him, that was the price. And he was willing to pay it. Lifeboat 4. That is the number. Remember it. Lifeboat 4, on the port side of the boat deck. It was being loaded by Second Officer Charles Lightoller, a man who was following his orders with rigid, almost military discipline. Women and children only. No exceptions. No special treatment. Lightoller had been given this rule, and he was going to enforce it if it was the last thing he did on this ship. And for many of the men standing on that deck, watching their wives and daughters climb into the boats, it was clear that this was not a temporary separation. This was not see you in an hour. This was goodbye. Some of the men understood it. Some did not. Some stood at the railing waving and smiling, still convinced that help was coming, that the ship would hold, that this was all an abundance of caution, and they would laugh about it over breakfast tomorrow. And some of the men stood at the railing and said nothing at all, because they knew. John and Madeline arrived at Lifeboat 4. The scene around them was controlled chaos. Women were being helped through windows on the enclosed promenade deck. The boat had been lowered to that level to make boarding easier. Children were being passed hand over hand from their fathers to the crew members standing in the boat. Some women were hysterical, some were silent. Some had to be physically lifted and placed into the boat, because their legs would not carry them. Madeline looked at the lifeboat. She looked at the dark water far below. She looked at her husband, and she grabbed his arm. She did not want to get in. She did not want to leave him. Every account of this moment, from the survivors who were standing nearby, from the officers who witnessed it, from the testimony given at the inquiries that followed, every account agrees on this point. Madeline did not want to go. She held on to John. She looked at him with the kind of fear that is not about the water, or the cold, or the ship going down. It is the fear of being separated from the person you love, when you know in your bones, in your blood, in the deepest part of your heart, that if you let go of them now, you will never see them again. John was calm. He had been calm all night. He had been calm when the ship hit the iceberg. He had been calm when he learned the ship was sinking. He had been calm when he put Madeline's life jacket on and led her through the crowds. And he was calm now. He turned to Lightoller and he asked a question. The question has been reported in slightly different ways by different survivors, but the substance is always the same. John asked if he could accompany his wife in the lifeboat. He explained that she was in a delicate condition. That was the phrase he used, delicate condition. The polite, formal, Gilded Age way of saying she is pregnant. He was not demanding. He was not threatening. He was not waving money or dropping his name or saying, "Do you know who I am?" He was asking, politely, formally, the way a gentleman asks a question when he already knows the answer but feels he owes it to his wife to ask anyway. Lightoller said no. No men. Women and children only. Those were the orders. That was the rule. And the rule applied to everyone, whether they were a steerage passenger from Ireland or the richest man in the world. No. John did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not try to push past. He did not offer money. He did not say anything at all for a moment. He just stood there. And then he did something that everyone who witnessed it remembered for the rest of their lives. He turned to Madeline. He took her in his arms. He helped her through the window and into the lifeboat. Some accounts say he lifted her. Some say he guided her. But every account says the same thing about how he did it. Gently. Carefully. The way you handle something precious. The way you handle the thing you love most in the world when you know you are touching it for the last time. Madeline was in the boat now. She was sitting down. She was looking up at him through the window. And John leaned in and asked the officer one more question. He asked for the number of the lifeboat. What number is this boat? That is what he wanted to know. Why? There are two explanations, and both of them break your heart. The first is that John genuinely believed he might survive, that he might find another boat, or that a rescue ship might arrive in time, or that somehow, against all odds, he would make it through the night. And if he survived, he wanted to know which boat Madeline was in so he could find her. So that when the nightmare was over and the sun came up and they pulled alongside a rescue vessel, he could go to Lifeboat 4 and she would be there and he could hold her again. That is the first explanation. The second is harder. The second is that John knew he was going to die, that he had known it for over an hour, that the question about the lifeboat number was not for him at all. It was for her. He asked it so that Madeline would believe he was coming, so that she would hear the calm confidence in his voice and think, he is going to find me. He just needs to know the number. He has a plan. He always has a plan. He is John Jacob Astor, and he will figure this out the way he figures everything out. He asked the question so that the last thing Madeline heard from her husband was not goodbye. It was a plan, a reason to hope, a lie maybe, the most loving, most generous lie a man has ever told. I do not know which explanation is true. Nobody does. Nobody ever will. And maybe it does not matter, because the effect was the same. Madeline heard the question. She heard the steadiness in his voice, and for a moment, maybe just a moment, maybe long enough to get her through the night, she believed he was coming. The boat began to lower, the davits creaked, the ropes groaned under the weight, and Madeline looked up as the distance between her and her husband grew. 5 feet, 10 feet, 20 feet, and she screamed his name. John. She screamed it the way people scream when something is being torn away from them that they cannot live without. Not a polite cry, not a composed call. A scream, raw and broken and animal, the kind of sound that comes from a place inside you that you did not know existed until the worst moment of your life. John stood at the railing. He did not turn away. He did not look down. He did not cover his face or close his eyes. He watched. He watched as the lifeboat descended, foot by foot, toward the water. He watched as Madeline's face got smaller and smaller, as the distance between them became something that no amount of money or power or love could close. He stood there, and he watched until the boat hit the water, until the crew began to row, until the little boat moved away from the great dying ship and disappeared into the darkness. He watched until he could not see her anymore. And then she was gone. His wife, his unborn child, the life he had chosen, the love that had cost him everything, his reputation, his friendships, his place in the world, all of it, in a small wooden boat, rowing away from him into the night. And John Jacob Astor IV was alone. He was standing on the deck of a ship that was sinking, in water so cold it would kill him in minutes, on a night so dark and so vast that not even the stars could help him. He was alone, and he was going to die, and there was nothing, not a single thing in the entire world that he could do about it. What did he do next? The accounts vary. Some survivors said he went back to the kennels and released the dogs, opened the cages and let them out so they would not drown trapped in the dark. Some said he went to the gymnasium and sat on one of the mechanical horses, waiting, alone, staring at nothing. Some said he stood on the deck and helped other women into boats, offering his hand steady and calm, as if you were hosting a dinner party instead of standing on a ship that was about to take him to the bottom of the ocean. What we know for certain is this. He did not panic. He did not fight. He did not try to sneak into a lifeboat dressed as a woman, the way some men did that night. He did not bribe anyone. He did not pull rank. He did not use his name or his money or his power to save himself. He had all the tools in the world to survive. He was John Jacob Astor IV. He was worth $2.5 billion. He knew the officers by name. He had dined with the captain. If any man on that ship could have talked his way onto a lifeboat, it was him. And he chose not to. He chose not to. He stood on that deck, and he let the lifeboats go without him. He let younger men, poorer men, men with no name and no fortune, stand beside him and face the same fate. He did not consider himself above them. Not in that moment, not when it mattered most. At 2:20 in the morning on April the 15th, 1912, the Titanic broke in half. The bow, flooded with thousands of tons of water, pulled the front of the ship down so far that the stern rose out of the water entirely, the propellers lifting into the air, the whole back half of the ship hanging vertical against the sky like a skyscraper that had been torn from its foundation. And then the ship came apart. The steel buckled. The rivets exploded. The lights, which had stayed on through the entire sinking, burning yellow and warm and defiant, the lights went out. All at once, and everything was dark. The bow went first, sliding under the water with a sound that survivors described as thunder, a deep, terrible rumbling that seemed to come from the center of the earth. Then the stern followed, filling with water, tilting, slipping beneath the surface with a long, slow, almost gentle motion. And then it was gone. The Titanic was gone. In her place was nothing. Just black water. And in that water, in that 28-degree water, under those impossible stars, were over 1,500 people. 1,500 human beings, screaming, dying, calling out for help that was not coming. The people in the lifeboats, including Madeleine, sitting in lifeboat 4 with her hands gripping the sides of the boat and her eyes wide and her mouth open, the people in the lifeboats heard it. They heard 1,500 people dying. They heard the screaming. And then, slowly, over the course of 20 or 30 minutes, the screaming stopped, one voice at a time, until there was nothing left but the sound of the water and the silence of the dead. John Jacob Astor IV was among them. Somewhere in that water, in the dark, in the cold, the richest man on the ship died the same death as the poorest. The water did not know his name. The cold did not care about his fortune. The ocean took him the way it took everyone else, without ceremony, without mercy, without distinction. He was 47 years old. 5 days after the Titanic sank, a cable ship called the Mackay Bennett arrived at the site of the disaster. Her job was not rescue. By then, there was no one left to rescue. Her job was recovery. Recovery of the dead. The crew of the Mackay Bennett spent days pulling bodies from the Atlantic Ocean. Hundreds of them, floating in their life jackets, drifting in the current, their faces turned up toward a sky that had given them nothing. Many of the bodies could not be identified. Many were buried at sea, weighted with iron bars and slipped back into the water, with a prayer and a splash and nothing else. But body number 124 was different. Body number 124 was wearing a blue serge suit. In his pockets, the crew found a gold watch. They found a gold chain. They found a diamond ring. They found $2,440 in cash, a fortune in 1912, enough to buy a house, outright. And they found a monogram, JJA, John Jacob Astor IV. They had found him. His body was taken to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and then transported to New York City by train. He was buried at Trinity Church Cemetery in Upper Manhattan, the same church, the same ground, the same neighborhood where his family had shaped the city for over a century. The funeral was private. The grief was enormous, and across New York, across the country, across the world, people who had mocked him, who had judged him, who had whispered about his scandalous young wife and his foolish old heart, those people fell silent. Because whatever they had thought of John Jacob Astor IV when he was alive, they could not deny what he had done when he was dying. He had stayed. He had stayed on that ship. He had put his wife in a boat and let her go, and turned around and walked back into the darkness. And no amount of gossip, no amount of scandal, no amount of moralizing from a pulpit or a newspaper column could take that away from him. Madeleine survived. She was pulled from Lifeboat 4 by the crew of the Carpathia, the rescue ship that arrived too late to save the Titanic, but just in time to save the people in the lifeboats. She was cold. She was in shock. She was 5 months pregnant, and she had just watched her husband die. The world she returned to was not the world she had left. Everything had changed. The newspapers that had savaged her, that had called her a gold digger and a homewrecker and worse, those newspapers now called her a widow, a tragic figure, a young woman carrying the child of a dead hero. The same society that had shut its doors in her face now opened them again, because tragedy has a way of making people generous after the fact, a way of making people kind when it no longer costs them anything. Madeleine went home to New York. She moved into the Astor mansion. She waited, and on August the 14th, 1912, 4 months after the Titanic went down, 4 months after John stood at that railing and watched her disappear into the night, Madeline gave birth to a son. She named him John Jacob Astor IV. He came into the world healthy, 10 fingers, 10 toes, crying alive, real. A baby boy born in New York City, in the city his father had wanted to come home to, in the city that bore his family's name. The baby who had been 5 months from being born on the night his father died. He made it. He survived. He was born into one of the greatest fortunes in American history, and he would never know his father. He would grow up hearing the stories. He would grow up seeing the photographs. He would grow up knowing that his father had been on the most famous ship in history and had chosen to stay behind so that his mother and his unborn self could live. But he would never sit on his father's lap. He would never hear his father's voice. He would never feel his father's hand on his shoulder, or hear his father say, "I am proud of you," or ask his father a question and get an answer. The man who wanted him so desperately, who was so overjoyed at the news of his coming, who crossed an ocean to bring him home, that man was gone, lost to the cold and the dark and the water. Madeline lived a complicated life after the sinking. The Astor family's will contained a provision. She would retain her inheritance and her use of the Astor properties only as long as she did not remarry. If she married again, she would lose it all. For a few years, she honored that provision. She stayed in the Astor world. She raised her son. She wore black. She was the tragic young widow, the symbol of everything the Titanic had taken. But in 1916, she remarried. His name was William Carl Dick, a childhood friend, a man her own age, and just like that, the Astor fortune was gone. The mansions, the trust fund, the life that John had built for her, all of it, taken away by a clause in a dead man's will. Madeline did not fight it. She moved on. She had 2 more children. She divorced Dick in 1933 and married again, a man named Enzo Fiamonte, an Italian boxer. That marriage ended in divorce too. Madeline died in 1940 at the age of 46. She was buried in Brooklyn. Not in the grand Astor plots, not beside John, in Brooklyn, quietly, without ceremony. She was 46 years old, almost exactly the same age John had been when he died. And her son, John Jacob Astor VI, grew up. He inherited a portion of the Astor Trust Fund, though not the lion's share. He served in the Navy during World War II. He married. He had children. He lived a life that was, by most accounts, quiet, private, and far from the spotlight that had consumed his parents. He died in 1992 at the age of 79. He had lived his entire life in the shadow of a father he never met, and a story he never asked to be part of. So now let me come back to the question I asked you at the beginning. The question I have been asking throughout this entire story. Who was John Jacob Astor IV? Was he a good man? Was he a bad man? Was he a romantic hero who loved deeply and sacrificed everything? Or was he a powerful man who used his money to take what he wanted? A man who divorced his first wife, married a teenager, and lived in a palace built on the rent money of people who could barely afford to eat? The honest answer is that he was both. He was all of it. He was a man who inherited a fortune built on the suffering of ordinary New Yorkers, and he never once gave that fortune back. He was a man who married a girl 29 years younger than him, and we will never fully know whether that was love, or possession, or something in between. He was a man who collected rent from tenement buildings and spent it on 11-course dinners and Turkish baths and suites on luxury liners. He was a product of a world that treated wealth as virtue and poverty as failure, and he never seriously questioned that world. Not really. Not in a way that cost him anything. That is one side of the truth. Here is the other side. He was also a man who invented things because he was genuinely curious about how the world worked. He was a man who wrote a science fiction novel because he dreamed about the future. He was a man who funded an entire artillery battery and then went to war himself because he believed he should not ask others to risk what he was not willing to risk. He was a man who loved Madeleine Force with a love so strong he gave up his entire social world for it. His friends, his clubs, He's standing, everything he had known since birth. And he did it without complaint. He did it with his chin up and his back straight, the way a man does something when he knows he is right, even if the whole world says he is wrong. And then there is the night that defined everything, the night that turned a complicated, flawed, privileged man into something that transcends judgment. Because on the night of April the 14th, 1912, when the water was rising and the ship was breaking apart, and the screams of the dying filled the air, on that night, John Jacob Astor IV did not use his money. He did not use his name. He did not use the power that had shaped every single day of his life up to that moment. He stood at a railing, and he put his pregnant wife into a lifeboat, and he let her go, and then he turned around and walked into the dark. He could have survived, maybe not easily, maybe not with certainty, but a man with his resources, his connections, his sheer force of presence, he could have found a way. Other rich men found ways. Other powerful men talked their way onto boats or pulled strings, or simply pushed past the officers in the chaos and jumped. John did not. He stood there, and he accepted it. He accepted that the rule was women and children first. He accepted that his money meant nothing. He accepted that his name, the most powerful name in New York, the name carved into the bedrock of Manhattan, was just a name, just letters, just sounds, worth nothing in the face of a sinking ship and an officer who would not bend. And in that acceptance, in that moment of standing at the railing with the water rising and the cold pressing in, and the knowledge that he was going to die settling into his bones like ice, in that moment, John Jacob Astor IV became something more than a rich man. He became something more than a scandal or a headline or a name on a hotel. He became a father who did the one thing that every parent in the world hopes they would have the courage to do if it came to it. He chose his child. He chose his wife. He chose their lives over his own. Not with a grand speech, not with a dramatic gesture, not with anything that would make a good scene in a movie. He chose them with silence, with steadiness, with a calm question about the number of a lifeboat. He chose them by stepping back. That is it. That is the whole story. A man who had everything gave it all up. Not his money, because his money meant nothing that night, but his life, his future, his chance to hold his son, his chance to see Madeline's face in the morning light again, his chance to grow old. He gave all of that up, and he did it quietly. That is how I think John Jacob Astor IV should be remembered. Not as a saint. He was not a saint. Not as a villain. He was not a villain. Not as a symbol of anything. Not of the Gilded Age. Not of wealth. Not of privilege. Not of tragedy. He was a man. A complicated, brilliant, flawed, restless, stubborn, loving man who lived a big life and made big mistakes and loved deeply and was punished for it and kept going anyway. And on the last night of his life, when everything he had built and everything he had earned and everything he had been given fell away, when the money was worthless and the name was meaningless and the ship was sinking and the water was coming, he did the right thing. He did the simple, terrible, beautiful right thing. He saved his wife. He saved his child. And he let the darkness take him. The ocean is still out there. 2 miles down, on the floor of the North Atlantic, the Titanic rests in pieces. The grand staircase is gone. The dining rooms are collapsed. The hull is covered in rust-colored stalactites of iron-eating bacteria, slowly dissolving the ship back into the earth. In 100 years, maybe less, there will be nothing left. The ship will be gone. The metal will be gone. The story will exist only in words and pictures, and the memories we choose to pass on. But the choice John Jacob Astor IV made on that night, the choice to stay, the choice to let go, the choice to put love above survival, that choice will last. Because that is how love works. It outlasts steel. It outlasts water. It outlasts the cold. It outlasts everything. He is gone. The ship is gone. But what he did, what he chose in the last minutes of his life, That remains, and it will remain for as long as anyone tells this story. So tell it. Remember him, not as the richest man on the Titanic, not as the scandal of Gilded Age New York. Remember him as the man who stood at the railing and watched the lifeboat go and did not turn away. Remember him as a father. Remember him as a man who, when everything else was stripped away, was left with nothing but his love. And his love was enough. It was enough to save the people who mattered most. It was enough to define who he truly was. And it is enough, even now, over 100 years later, to make you feel something when you hear his name. John Jacob Astor IV. Remember him.